Hello and welcome to the Pots Trowels podcast with me, Martin Fish, joined as usual by Sean and
Hello
Jill.
there.
Hi.
And this week I've been out to catch up with a friend and fellow horticulturist of mine, David Hurrion, who's got a new book out on raised beds. So we'll find out all about that later on.
And we've got some listeners' questions, so some on camellias, some on pleached hedges, and even a sweet pea question, I think, as well.
Great stuff. And if you've got a question for the team, just drop us an email, info@potsandtrowels.com, and we'll get to it as soon as we can. But before we answer this week's questions, let's hear from David.
Well, David, it's great to catch up with you today. Beautiful day. We're sitting out in a wonderful garden at the moment, and lots of people know you because of your writing and broadcasting work. You judge at the RHS shows, and in fact you've got a new book out at the moment called The Raised Bed Book, which looks really interesting, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. But just to start us off, because you, like me, have worked in horticulture a long time, tell us how it all started for you.
Been in horticulture, man and boy, Martin, that's what it is. So I'm getting on a bit now, and I guess I've been around the block a few times, but I always gardened since I was so young. You know, probably about 5 is when my first really conscious memories of gardening, with my aunts and uncles who brought me up, and I just had so much information from them. They were a lot older than me, and you know, they were in their 60s when I was a little kid, and they had, it was almost like the generations skipped to generation, you know.
Yeah.
And they had so much knowledge from their upbringing that you wouldn't get today, and it taught me so much. And I always was convinced that I wanted to go to a horticultural college, so I went to Writtle College near Chelmsford in Essex, and did a higher national diploma in horticulture. I'd worked in the industry as well before I went there. I had to do a pre-entry year, which I think is really important, you know, to make sure that you want to do it, you know, before you commit to a course. And then I worked in different nurseries around the country, most notably at Holcombe Hall in North Norfolk.
Because you are a Norfolk boy, aren't you?
Well, by descent, let's put it that way. I grew up a mixture of Norfolk, which is where my family had lots of connections, and then also South London. So, you know, boxing between the two. But I was lucky enough to work at a nursery, at Holcombe Park Nursery, and it was such a good grounding before I went to college. And then after I left college, there wasn't a lot of gardening jobs or jobs in horticulture around. So I decided after a few years of trying to scrap together a living that I'd go and retrain as a teacher, because I thought, you know, the people that have inspired me to do this have been in education. So I guess I'm a horticulturist by passion, I'm a teacher by vocation, a communicator by vocation. And of course that's led me on to working in journalism on different magazines. I was the deputy editor of Gardener's World most recently, but also in journalism, in radio journalism and some TV stuff as well. And been really lucky enough to go around the world with people looking at plants and gardens, you know, on these gardening holidays. So, do you know what? I've had a blessed life, Martin.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't feel like work, does it, what we do?
It's similar trajectory to you, isn't it, really?
And you are, I know, I mean, I've known you for a number of years, we've worked together. You are very much a plantsman as well. You are passionate about plants, and as a result, you do lots of tours, not only the UK, as you say, around the world, showing people wonderful plants, don't you?
Yeah, I've been so fortunate to go to South Africa, for example, where there's such an amazing diversity of plant material down there. I've been lucky enough to go there almost 20 times, I think, now, with groups, looking at plants. And they would tell you, you know, I'm such a mad, keen, bonkers plantsman that I'll say, stop the coach! And, you know, scrabbling around at the side of the road looking at some rarity, you know, it's a joy. It's an absolute joy. And if I can share some of that passion with people, you know, general gardeners, you know, what better way to spend your life, eh?
Oh, absolutely. Now, can I ask you a question about when you're doing these foreign tours? Because obviously you're seeing a different range of plants that you'd see here in the UK. Do you find, I mean, it might just be me, the older you get, the more difficult it is to remember names and actually retain the names of some of these plants?
You're dead right. I mean, when I was a student, I found it really easy to learn them. So we had, at college, we had to learn 100 plants a week, and we were tested on a random 20. And so I found it quite easy to learn them then, and all the way through my 20s, my 30s, even my 40s, add more and more into that random access memory in your head. And now they sort of escape me. But I normally have to think for up to 5 minutes, and I can eventually recall it.
So it's in there somewhere.
It's
just finding, like rummaging in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet.
Well, it is like that random access memory on a computer, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's totally random, and it's in there somewhere, like you say.
Yeah. So your garden, you live now in Dorset.
Yeah, North Dorset.
And you've got a garden there. Just tell us a little bit about your garden. I mean, is it full of weird and wonderful plants?
It is. And let me just first dissuade people from thinking, oh, isn't he lucky living in Dorset? I am. It's a very blessed county. But where I live, North Dorset, it's a real frost pocket. It's called the Blackmore Vale. And it seems to attract all the cold weather in the winter, drains down from the moors and everything. So I'm battling against it very often to try and get some of the more tender plants, which I have a real passion for, getting some of those more tender plants to survive. But anyway, it's not a very big garden either by a lot of professional gardeners' standards. It's about 100 foot long. Big by a lot of hobby gardener standards, I suppose. 100 foot long and about 60 foot wide. And it's divided up into sections. So I've got a sort of subtropical garden immediately outside the back of the house. And then I've got a rose garden with roses and shrubs and perennials. And then at the end of the garden, I've got some little now, they're about 40 foot high, but I've got a collection of birch trees.
Right.
Loads of different coloured stemmed birches that I planted about 20 years ago. And they're all coming to maturity now, and that's where my woodland garden is. And I think everybody should try and make a bit of space for a little dappled shady woodland garden.
I agree. Regardless of how small the garden is, there are trees or shrubs that you can grow as multi-stem to create that woodlandy effect.
Well, that three-dimension and that
Exactly.
height, and as you say, that dappled shade underneath. And then also I grow vegetables as well in various people's gardens for them, and get to share some of that crop as well, because I haven't got enough room, unfortunately, to have a veg garden as well.
No, but I suppose because of the job you've done for a long time, writing for magazines and editing magazines and book work, you've got to grow as wide a range of plants as possible just to give you that practical experience.
Well, I think, like you, I really relish the fact that I am not necessarily a jack of all trades and master of none, but I have a very wide love of plants and passion for growing things. So I don't try and specialise in anything particularly, because I think if you have a wider knowledge, then it means that you can grow pretty much anything. So that's how I view it.
I always think of us like the GP, the general practitioner of the medical world. We're not consultants in various health issues. We're all rounders.
So does that make us GHs?
Probably general horticulturists.
Horticulturists.
That's right. Exactly. That's what we are. Definitely.
I like it.
We're going to talk about the book in a few minutes, but other work you do, because you're involved with the RHS. You're a member of the RHS Tender Ornamental Plant Committee.
I sound very impressive, don't I, really? But I have to pinch myself sometimes that I'm a member of that committee. So that's one of the important committees that makes the decisions about whether plants get awards of garden merit, and also judging plants as whether they are garden worthy. But also I'm involved in show judging as well, in the floral marquee, because my real passion is going around all those fantastic nurseries at the RHS shows and looking at the fabulous plants that they've got on offer. So that's another one of the voluntary aspects of my work that I really relish.
It is, and you know, I do that with you. That's why we're here today. We're actually sitting outside at RHS Wisley on this. It's a beautiful day. The cherry blossom, one of the few we've had. Yes, there was blue sky, and what are those little white fluffy things? Oh, they're clouds, aren't they? Little clouds against a white blue sky, and the cherry blossom is out, and it does feel like spring is definitely with us now. We're here actually on a judges training day, aren't we? So to update us so that we can judge fairly and
well, that's
properly.
The key thing about judging with the RHS, that it's done very objectively, with a whole raft of objectives that we have to follow, and we have to follow very strict criteria to make sure that we judge things fairly, and this is one of those refresher days where we get brushed up on our technique.
Exactly, yes, and a chance to look around this
Great
wonderful
opportunity.
garden. David, the Raised Bed book is out now, written by David Hurrion. It's got your name on the cover there. So can we talk all about that in a few minutes' time?
Yeah, of course we can.
I'm really looking forward to the part about the raised bed book, because it might finally inspire me to rip the plastic covering and cellophane off the raised beds I bought back in November. I mean, you know, yeah. It's funny though, because we was just thinking about that last section you were chatting to David. It sounded like the wind was getting up a bit, didn't it? It was, you know, not to talk about the weather as we Brits do, but
well, we often do, don't we? Yes. Yeah. No, it was. We were sitting outside. We were, as we mentioned, we were on a judges' training day for when we're judging at the RHS shows, and we at lunchtime popped out, sat in the spring sunshine at Wisley, surrounded by beautiful blossom. But all of a sudden, this wind from behind us came, and David was trying to hold the book up, the raised bed book, as a wind shield. And I've got a shield on the microphone, but you could just hear a little bit of it there. So I do apologise. I need to get a new sound crew. With me.
That's right. Well, it's a bit like, did you think he was on video? He's holding the book up, you know, to get it in shot.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I don't.
So you've actually seen the book, haven't you, Martin? I've not seen it yet.
I have.
But,
It's it's a lovely book.
good.
I mean, it's very, very comprehensive. I mean, there are other books on raised beds, but David covers everything in it, as we talked about. You know, it's not. People think of just growing veg in it, which is probably what you're thinking of doing, Sean. Maybe I don't know, but you can essentially grow anything from ponds to exotic plants. All you're doing is creating essentially a giant pot, and it is a very comprehensive book.
I look forward to hearing you guys discussing that in the second part. I mean, he also mentioned that where he lives is a frost pocket. I like the idea of a frost pocket. I mean, it's 14 degrees here in Nottingham at the minute. What's the weather like up in Lincolnshire?
Wet.
Well, across.
It's
well,
wet.
it
It's
is
just started
mild.
raining again. Well, it is mild, but
It
it's
is mild.
raining
Yes.
again.
I think the temperatures are above average for the time of the year, because, you know, here we are sort of third week in March now, so it would be a little bit cooler. We're in double figures, but it is while we've started, it's a wonder you can't hear the rain pelting on the roof at the moment.
But having said that, we managed to have a day in the garden yesterday, so we had a full day because we're trying to get to grips with our back garden. And I did notice when you were chatting to David, you sounded very envious of his 20-year-old woodland that he'd created in his garden. It will happen here, Martin. Have faith.
It will happen here, and we are. I mean, it's not going to be a woodland, but
Just give it 20 years.
you've got to rely on me living.
We'll still be doing the
another
podcast
20
in 20 years and tell you all about
I
it.
could just imagine it. I'm sitting in my little woodland.
Episode 2042.
Oh, that's quite scary, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So yeah,
David came across very humble. Nice guy, really,
Yeah.
really humble
David is
guy,
a lovely
you know.
guy. He really is. I mean, we've known him for quite a few years, working through magazines. So our paths cross at various times, and he's a really lovely, genuine guy. They don't make them like that anymore.
And such an expert plantsman as well.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Yes.
I noticed he said when he was a student he was learning 100 plant names a week. I struggled to
I was trying to
remember
think
one.
about, I don't know if I know 20, never mind 100.
No, exactly.
Well, but that's when I was a student. It was exactly the same.
Was it?
We had a list of 100 different things. It could be conifers, it could be shrubs, it could be grasses, it could be whatever, and you had to learn them for your ident on a Saturday morning. They'd only probably pick 30 or 40 out of 100, but you got to learn
And
them.
with
And I think
pictures
now,
to identify?
no pictures. It would
Just the
just give you
names.
the full botanical name of the plant and where you could find it in the college grounds. So you could go and find it,
right.
have a look at it,
Oh, God.
see the label on it, and you'd got to remember them. And we used to do 100 at a time.
So when they did, you talk about them doing a plant ident, obviously identification. So what would they do? Bring you bits of a plant and you had to identify them?
We used to do our plant identifications on a Saturday morning, so it was a full-time college course, and in those days full-time meant full-time, including Saturday mornings.
Don't get controversial.
And they would bring sort of a selection of 30 that had been on that list. They would be laid out on long benches. We had a huge potting shed where we used to do all the practicals, and they would be numbered 1 to 30, and you would go along with your clipboard and write them down. But you had to get the names spot on. You couldn't say that's, think of a Elaeagnus pungens maculata. You had to spell it correctly. So for every typo you made, you lost half a point.
Oh, wow.
And a plant name was worth 5 points. So for every typo you made, or you got if you got double exclamation instead of single, capital where it should be a lowercase, you would lose half a point. So technically, if you spelled them wrong, even though you knew the plants, you could lose all the points and get nothing for it.
Did you ever
They
end
were
up in
tough
minus
days.
points for your spelling, or was it?
No, I didn't. No, I always touch wood. I used to get sort of 95, 100% most of
Well,
my
that's why
items.
you're now
I
a
can't
general
remember.
horticulturalist, isn't it?
That's it. But the problem is, Sean, 45 years on from being a student, I can't remember what those plants are.
Well, that's where Google comes in these days, isn't it? I mean, we can just. But it's interesting because I think that's shifted in, and this is not a podcast about education, but where people are learning where they can find things out rather than what the things are, rather than.
Absolutely.
I think it's time now we found a little bit more about those raised beds from David.
David, tell me about this book then. I mean, it's a lovely book. It's a hardback. It's got lots and lots of pages. It literally covers everything, doesn't it, that you need to know about raised beds?
Well, if you think about it, a lot of the books that are about raised bed growing are about nailing a few planks together and growing vegetables in a bit of compost, aren't they, really? And I thought, well, actually, it's a bigger topic than that. Raised beds come into all sorts of aspects of garden design. So you might want to design a garden with a raised pond or a raised lawn or retaining beds on a sloping site. All of this sort of covers my remit of raised beds. But also, if you're having trouble mobility-wise, you want to make your gardening easier, then raised beds, whether they're for growing vegetables or ornamental plants, are really crucial to bring the garden up to you where you can manage it more easily. And then the other thing about raised beds is that they've got to be sustainable, I believe. And a lot of these raised beds that are knocked together out of a few old planks and then filled with bagged compost, that compost sinks very quickly, the boards rot, and to me that's not a sustainable way of growing. So I talk in the book about how getting that soil mixture, that growing medium, if you like, that mixture of soil and organic matter to grow things really well. It's really crucial. So there's lots of advice about that in the book as well. And of course, raised beds are also an ideal way to tailor the growing conditions specifically for your plants, because some plants need very free draining conditions. Some plants need moisture retention. Some plants need acid soil. Some plants need alkaline soil. So it looks at all these aspects of tailoring your growing conditions with raised beds to suit whatever you want to grow.
Absolutely. And I think lots of people, I mean, we had raised beds in our old garden, but I didn't think of them as raised beds, to be fair, because what we did was we'd got a bit of a rough old lawn on a mound, so we excavated the lawn to lower the level to do a little patio area, but we left the sides and bricked around it. So in effect, we created raised beds, but
by digging down in the middle.
And I hadn't thought of it until reading your book, because you cover everything in there that you need to know. Like you say, not just growing vegetables, herbs. You can use them for any type of plant in there. So just flick through and let's just look at some of the content.
One of the things that I really like about it is that I've come up with all sorts of things that are perhaps outside the box. See what I did there?
Yes,
raised bed
exactly,
box.
But it's not rehearsed.
For example, a raised lawn, for example, is a great way to have a seating area in the garden. So if you created a raised bed and then sowed the top with grass seed or put turfs down, you've got a nice lounging area that's raised above the surrounding ground. You can fill that with fill the raised bed with some free draining soil so that it doesn't become waterlogged, so that the grass dries out nicely, so you've got somewhere dry to sit out on. So that's one idea. I'm also a great believer in raising water gardens as well, so having raised ponds in the garden so that you get the ability to have water falling from one level down to the other. And then also indoors, raised beds aren't just for outdoors. So if you've got a conservatory, you could have a raised bed built in one corner of the conservatory and then grow a collection of plants in that raised bed so that they're growing in much more volume of soil, so that they'll survive much better than having a collection of different plants growing in individual pots. So that you can be really creative with it and come up with an incredible array of different growing methods by thinking outside the box, as I say.
Exactly, and you can be very innovative and do lots of things. And as you say, you talk about the soil, the planting, the maintenance, and I think that was a good thing. I get a bit of a bee in my bonnet where people create a raised bed and just fill it with bagged potting compost.
Oh, it drives me insane.
Because plants will grow in it, but that just rots away and sinks very quickly. Plants need organic matter, but they also need that mineral matter, don't they?
It
the sand
decomposes
and the silts and the clays.
so quickly unless you have proper soil.
Yes.
And so actually, there are ways of using raised beds. So, for example, this is one of the other pages where this is a straw bale garden. So if you really want to improve the soil in your garden generally, you can get straw bales, excavate planting pockets in them, stick some soil in there, and then plant into it and get that straw bale to be your raised bed, and gradually that straw will break down and it will rot down into the surrounding soil, and then you're gradually improving the soil underneath. So you can be really, really creative. And raised beds have been used historically since the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. You've heard of them?
I have, yeah. You don't remember them, though,
I
do
don't
you?
remember
No.
them. But the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were raised beds.
Really?
Were created
Yeah.
in walled raised beds. The terraces at Machu Picchu on that mountaintop were raised beds. They've been used for thousands of years, and they are still used around the world today. So, for example, in Africa, they've got a whole new system that they've developed over the last 20 years called keyhole gardens, where they build round raised beds, almost like a cheese with a section cut out of it, if you can imagine, a circle with a section cut out of it, to allow access to the centre, where you have a compost heap in the middle, and then the growing space around it, so that you're raising and corralling the plants into a small area. And they're using those in some of the townships in South Africa, for example. People have got their own little growing plot with really good growing conditions so that they can grow their own food and stay healthy.
Yeah.
So there are so many creative ways that we can use them.
I mean, it must have taken a long time, because you're responsible for the content for this book, and it isn't just an ordinary book on raised beds. This is, I say, so comprehensive. It's probably the most comprehensive one I've seen. Doing the research must have taken quite a long time to get all this information and different chapters.
Do you know, one of the brilliant things is that I ended up being a magazine journalist for about, 25, almost 30 years. And that means that I'm really keen to research and find out proper, reliable information. So part of the research probably took me about a year to do the research in the run-up to actually being commissioned to write the book in the first place. And then when I came to write it, of course, all that material was in my brain, and I could sort of disgorge it into a book in a what I felt was a really good way. And there's all sorts of things like the water table in raised beds. If you're lifting the soil surface up above the surrounding ground, of course that's going to have an effect on the water table and how that water gets up into the soil and the plants.
And which you've demonstrated beautifully in the book, showing the level of how it drains and where the moisture stays. So lots of technical advice in there.
Yeah, looking at soil and how soil works, because proper soil, as you've already mentioned, is a mixture of mineral particles like grit and sand and whatever other particles, and also organic matter. And that's something that we can learn a really important lesson in today's world, where we're being challenged to garden without peat composts. If you mix soil, native soil, with organic matter, you can create a really good planting medium in which plants will really, really grow well.
Yeah.
And we must move away from just relying on those peat-based composts. In fact, they're going to be banned fairly shortly, but moving away from them. But the peat alternatives, most of them tend to be just organic based, and proper soil that gives plants everything they need is this mix of not only organic matter but also mineral matter too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. We need that longevity in that planting medium, don't
Definitely.
we? So the Raised Bed book, it's available now.
It is.
Printed by Dorling Kindersley, published by Dorling Kindersley.
Yep.
And where can anybody get this book, David?
So you can get it. I've just been into the bookshop here at Wisley and found it on the shelves, and I'm so proud of that. So you can buy it in all good independent bookshops. There are independent bookshops online as well. You can also get it through larger sellers, people like Waterstones online and the Waterstones bookshops. You can also get it from Amazon, and it's cheaper on some of those online sites, but I'm a great believer in trying to support the independent book companies.
Yes.
Or you can go to davidhurrion.com, which is my website, and there's a link there to get a signed copy, because you can only buy signed copies through my website.
There you go. So to me, that's the way to do it.
Do you
so
reckon?
They've got your autographed and a little message in there from David himself.
Well, I can also put a special message if you want to buy the book for a family member. perhaps they're just getting into gardening and they want to grow some plants in raised beds, then I can send them a special message as well. Or if you just want to buy it yourself to have as a keepsake, then I can inscribe it with a specific message.
So ideally, people, if they go to your website, davidhurrion.com,
that's correct,
they can find out everything they need to know about it and how to get one.
You can find out all about what's in the book, and you can find out how to buy one.
Brilliant. Well, good luck with it, David. I'm sure it will be on the bookshelves for a long time, because it's one of those books that is timeless and will just go on for many, many years. It will become like one of those must-go-to books on the bookshelf, I hope, for lots of people.
I really hope so, because I've thoroughly enjoyed putting it together.
Excellent. Plans for any more in the pipeline?
Yeah, there are. Yeah. But I would have to kill you if I told you.
Well, at that point, we better end it there. David, thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin.
That sounds like such a good book. I hope we can get a copy. Is it somebody's birthday coming up? So, no, mine.
Yours
probably
is next.
Okay, that's okay.
Sorted. Well done.
I'd have to have it personally signed by David, though, from
Absolutely.
his website.
Oh, that's doable.
The straw bale idea in a raised bed is great, because that would really contain the straw, wouldn't it? And you've grown in the greenhouse. You did something in a straw bale.
Yeah,
didn't you?
similar thing. I did it several times where it was just a straw bale, and you water it. You put a nitrogen fertiliser on it, which sort of heats it all up, and then a bit of compost on the top, and the roots go down into it and find all that nitrogen, and it works. But if you contained them with an edging around them, it wouldn't blow away and everywhere. So yeah, it's a good way. And then it makes wonderful compost at the end of the day when you've grown in it. Stick it in your compost heap. It rots down so quickly and makes great compost for the rest of the garden.
I was listening to what he was saying about the water feature, not water features. Was it water features? Well, raised beds and then raised kind of ponds, effectively. And it just reminds me of those pictures of when people put fish tanks upside down in ponds and the fish end up looking at you. Have you seen those at all?
I'd be a bit wary of those, I think. I'm not sure
I'm not
would
convinced
work,
that they're a real thing. I don't know. I mean, I think people do it.
No, I think
as a
it's like
one-off.
in resin.
Yeah.
I think the poor fish would be a bit scared, think they're going to fall out, wouldn't they? So it would be a bit odd.
It's like when we go up to the top of a skyscraper or something and look down on one of those artificial floors.
Everybody looks like ants.
Think, yeah.
But I think a raised pond is a good idea, because it gives you sort of, if you've got an edge into it, you've got a platform to sit on, and you're actually sitting at water level, and you can really appreciate it and see it. Whereas otherwise, if it's in the ground, you've got to get down on your hands and knees to get close to it. So I think it's now we're getting to a certain age, Mrs. Fish. I think raised beds and raised gardening is the future for us.
Yeah, well, you don't need to be of a certain age, do you, really?
No.
Anything that helps save your knees.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And those keyhole gardens were intriguing as well. I was thinking of them like Trivial Pursuits kind of counters, where you put the slices of cake in, but you sort of you leave one out and you get to walk across it.
Got a wedge out. Yeah,
really fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's a clever idea. So you can actually get inside to maintain the plants, isn't it? It's a clever idea. I mean, they've obviously been around for a lot longer than we think. Gardening with raised beds is not a new concept, is it, really?
Absolutely. We've had a few questions through on various... Well, we've had some questions on some of the videos we've done on YouTube. We start with this one from James Dowdle about pleached hedges, asking the question, how far apart you plant the trees? I mean, surely that's down to taste, isn't it? It depends on the tree, right?
Well, with a pleached hedge, the idea is to get a continuous sort of hedge with it. So for those that are listening that don't know what a pleached hedge is, it's essentially a single stem trunk of a tree, maybe 6 feet, 2 meters high. Some of them are lower, and then instead of letting the head grow in a normal tree shape, it's fanned out onto a trellis of bamboo canes.
Try not to knock Jill out as you're doing those hand movements, because obviously people on the podcast can't see hand movements.
That's right. I'm gesticulating. So it's essentially a hedge on a stilt. What you need to do, James, if you want that continual hedge, and people plant them against a fence very often, so you've got extra height above your fence. That's the idea for privacy. So what you ought to divide an area of the garden. I would plant them depending how big or how wide your pleached hedges are. So if they've got a 6 foot coverage, then plant them 6 foot apart. So they basically need to touch. That's the plan. They need to touch so that you haven't got any gaps in between them. So you just plant one and then plant the next one so that the hedge bit is actually going to touch.
We've also had a couple of questions about camellias. One from Antoinette. These are both coming on Facebook. One from Antoinette, who says, what is the best place to plant one in the garden, and does it need protection from an east wind? And then Jeanette has said, how old do camellias have to be before they flower? I have a young plant with just one stem about 2 feet tall.
Okay, so Antoinette, depending where you live, if you're in the northern hemisphere like we are, then you would want to plant it away from the east winds or cold northerly wind ideally. They're technically sort of edge of woodland plants, so they do like sun on them, but they don't mind a little bit of dapple shade. But certainly what they don't want is that east coldly wind or north wind when the flowers are opening, because it would damage them. So a sheltered, fairly sunny with a little bit of shade is ideal for them.
I think the other camellia question was from Jeanette Russell. How old do they have to be before they flower? I have a young plant with just one stem, about 2 feet tall.
Yeah, well, they should flower when they're quite young. I mean, if you go to a nursery or a garden centre, you'll often see them in a sort of 8-inch pot in flower, just a small plant that's maybe only, sort of a foot or so tall. So they will flower when they're young. But I notice on yours, you say that you've got a plant that's got just one stem about 2 feet tall. So yours is growing up, and ideally what you want yours to do is to bush out. So I think what I would do, if you've got no flowers on that at the moment, I would actually, now is the perfect time to do it as well. Here we are, end of March, going into spring. I would cut that 2-foot stem down. You don't have to take a lot off, but maybe take a third of it off, cut it down to above a bud, and then it will make it branch out, and instead of a single stem you'll get a multi-branched bushy plant, and then within a year or so you should start to get some flowers.
Excellent stuff. Another question from Chompers on the video about pinching out sweet peas. And the question was just probably a bit of clarification, because the video is obviously very comprehensive and doesn't need explanation, but just asking, do we pinch to the third set of leaves? Is it that specific? Is that how you do it?
No, I mean, it doesn't really matter. The reason you pinch out the seedlings of sweet peas is when they're a few inches tall, by pinching out the growing tip, it encourages side shoots. So instead of a single stem, a little bit like the camellia that we've just talked about, you get a bushier plant, more flowering stems. Some people do it, some people don't. It doesn't have to be after 3 sets of leaves. If you let them get a bit bigger and you pinch them out, it doesn't really make any difference. I do tend to pinch mine out. I've just been potting my sweet pea seedlings into individual pots, and they'll go out in the garden when they've made a root system in about another 3 or 4 weeks, and I've pinched the tips out, and they should make a lovely plant. And on the subject of doing little jobs in the garden, there's still time to sow sweet peas. If you haven't sown them and you've still got a packet, you could do them in pots, but this time of the year you could put them straight into the garden where you want them to flower. So just cultivate the ground, put those sweet pea seeds in, and they'll be through. And I'm doing some other seed sowing in the greenhouse, because I'm planning ahead to what I can plant out into the garden in about a month or so's time, when the weather's a little bit warmer. So I'm going to be sowing into modules my dwarf French beans. So I've got a lovely dwarf French bean, a dwarf one that is called Stanley, which has got lovely long pods on it. I'm going to be putting some lettuce in the modules, and the brassicas, the summer cabbages and the calabres, and all of those can go in now, ready to produce plants for the garden in about a month or 6 weeks' time.
If you've got a question for Martin, just drop us an email at info@potsandtrowels.com. That's POTSANDTROWELS. Could you see the cogs whirring when I was trying to remember how to say
yeah,
it?
good.
And if you've got a few minutes just to pop a review on this podcast, that really helps us reach a few more people. And obviously feel free to share it with anyone you know who enjoys gardening.
Please do. And that's it. I think we've covered an awful lot this week.
We seem to have done, don't we? But yeah, we'll be back next week.
We will. We'll see you then.
More listeners' questions, hopefully some of your questions, and we'll see you then.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Watch the videos on YouTube or Facebook, follow us on Instagram, Twitter or X, and subscribe to the podcast and never miss a thing. For more information, go to potsandtrowels.com.